Welcome to another seminar for the ÉCRITS. The Seminars for the ÉCRITS is a series being hosted by Philosophy Portal throughout the month of July. These seminars serve to introduce to a wider audience some of our guest lecturers for the next official Philosophy Portal course, which will be focused on Lacan's ÉCRITS and which starts September 3rd. Just as a quick note, on all seminar days, there will be a sale for the ÉCRITS course that is run throughout the entire day. This seminar series, however, and more importantly, functions as a way to pay an homage to Lacan for his two major styles of presenting his work, both in seminars and in writing form. Last week, we hosted Peter Rollins to discuss pyrotheology, and this week, it's my pleasure to introduce Todd McGowan to discuss lack and desire. So Todd, the floor is yours, sir, and really excited to have you here with us.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's my delight to be here and to talk with you. I'd like to today get to the idea and get to an understanding of the idea of lack through initially contrasting it with loss. So I think sometimes these two things are blended together. So sometimes we think lack is loss, loss is lack. We use the term as synonyms. And use the terms as synonyms. I want to insist on the distinction between the two and to say that that's one way to think about what it is that psychoanalysis specifically is contributing and what specifically this line of thinking from Freud to Lacan and then to the present day, how it conceives of subjectivity. So I think there's one way to conceive, and there's other deviations, or I would call them heresies, within psychoanalysis that I think take up the idea of a subject of loss. But I think that through Freud, Lacan, and then into the contemporary thinkers, and I think Freud even gets this from Kant and Hegel, although he's not thinking about that, he's not aware of that, that for that tradition, it's specifically lack and not loss. And I just let me just lay out what I mean by that law, if one thinks of the subject as a subject of loss, what does that mean? It means that there initially was some kind of self-identity, self-harmony, and then something comes along and breaks that up. And I think there are times where you listen to or read what Freud says, and it seems like this is what he's getting at, that he's getting at this idea that, okay, first you had some satisfaction, say, with the mother's breast or the baby bottle, and then all of a sudden that relationship is interrupted and you experience the loss of that. And then the rest of your existence, you're a subject of loss because you no longer have that initial satisfaction. I think sometimes Freud might suggest something in that direction, but I think that is not really the Freudian insight or the essence of the Freudian discovery, that instead what he's getting at is that one starts out as a being, as a subject of lack. So there's never an initial satisfaction of whatever the object might be, breast, baby bottle, anything, right? So the point is any kind of object, teddy bear. I don't know why I said that. The relationship to the object is always one of lack or some kind of missing of that object. And I think that's, for Freud, the basis of subjectivity. And so I think it's really important to make this distinction between I didn't initially have something and I still am lacking. So the question is, how can one be a lacking being if one never initially had the self-identity in the first place? How does lack get constituted if there's not some initial self-identity that then is secondarily lost? And I think first of all, I think it's important to think what's at stake in this opposition between lack and loss. I'll just say this, that I think if you think in terms of loss, then there's always this lurking possibility, even if you know that it can't be realized, of re-obtaining the thing that's been lost. And so that idea, and that shapes the whole way that you think about the status of subjectivity, that there's something's been lost. I have this idea of always trying to retain it. And I think it shapes the way you think of desire. If you think that initially there was some kind of identity, some kind of wholeness, some kind of oneness that's subsequently lost, then you think, well, desire is about the desire to regain wholeness. And I think a lot of people that talk about psychoanalysis, not necessarily people that are within psychoanalytic thinking, but people that talk about psychoanalysis think, well, the idea is that we have this unconscious desire to reattain or regain wholeness. And I think that is absolutely wrong. I think that is not the nature of unconscious desire. And it seems to me like that's one way in which this idea of loss is deceptive. That if you invest yourself in loss, I think it just follows from that you're going to invest yourself in the idea of overcoming lack, regaining wholeness. And that I don't think, and I think this is true within the psychoanalytic tradition that I want to talk about, that is not the way that desire works. So if we think about lack as our starting point rather than loss, then all of a sudden the nature of desire changes. So lack and desire, to me, are just this two different names for the same thing. And this, just a little sidebar, this puts psychoanalysis very much at odds with someone like Gilles Deleuze, who thinks desire is about production and not about lack. For psychoanalysis, I think desire is only about lack. That desire and lack, there's no difference between them, and you can't conceive of desire outside of the structure of lack. So how can there be lack if there's nothing that was originally lost? That's the idea, and I think that's what the psychoanalytic tradition that I'm talking about wants to get at. That lack itself is the starting point. It's not the lack of something. In fact, it's the lack of nothing. And I think that's the key idea. And I think one way to think about that is to think about the opposition between subjectivity and whatever kind of symbolic identity one has. So I think that one essential core of the idea of lack is that one never is one's symbolic identity. So subjectivity is the failure to be any kind of identity. So no matter what identity comes along, I can try to assume that identity, but no matter how much effort I make to be that thing, I can't be it. And again, it's the idea isn't that initially I was this identity and then I lost it and now I'm going to try to regain it. No, every attempt to get it is a failure, and because I didn't once have it, I come into existence in relationship to that identity, but I'm always failing to get this identity. And I think this is one can think in terms of what Louis Althusser calls the ideological hail of the subject. So ideology is trying to hail you into this is a detour from Althusser, would not. He thinks ideology hails us as a subject. I want to say, no, ideology hails us as a symbolic identity. So ideology confronts subjects and says, you are this symbolic identity. But no matter how much we strive to be the thing that ideology sets up for us to be, we never fully are that thing. And I think it's one way you can recognize this is to realize or look at or investigate the disjunction that exists between every identity, that possibility for identity that you have, starting with your name, right? Like there's a sense everyone's had this experience of a certain alienation from one's own name. I have a neighbor who's like 7 years old, 6 years old, something. And she all of a sudden just found her own name alienating. And she said, I'm just going to go by my Hebrew name. Her actual name is Cordelia and her Hebrew name is Maya. And she said, I'm just going to go I only want to be called Maya now. So and this lasted, I don't know, 2-3 months. And then she went back. She got over the alienation. But the idea is that, and I think everyone is excited. We thought it was funny, but not because we thought she was crazy, but because we thought, well, wow, that's a real nice indication of the way in which no matter how much you like your name, you still have this moment of distance from it or alienation from it that you can't get over. And I think that's that's the first way in which lack is most often evident to us relative to the relationship between subjectivity and symbolic identity, that we don't fit in the name. The other thing I think is that certain symbolic roles that have an identity attached to them come down to us, and our disjunction with them is constantly made evident to us because of the way in which our desire doesn't fit within the confines of the identity, right? So lack is one way I think of thinking of it, which to me is helpful, is lack is the lack of a symbolic identity. So whatever identity, say, and I think the symbolic identity that can run the gambit. So it can be the name, right, which is a clear symbolic thing. It can be a certain job title, like professor, lawyer, dentist, teacher. Any of these titles, they all have a symbolic investiture attached to them. And so you tried, by adopting that title, you try to align yourself with the identity and think that that's just what I am. But then every time you do that, you feel this inadequacy, or you experience the inadequacy of the identity and yourself relative to the identity. So I think the inadequacy works in both ways. So you both feel, you experience that the identity doesn't work for you, but also that you don't work for the identity. So I never am adequate to the identity. Anytime, and this happens almost every time I go in front of a class as a professor, I have the experience like, I'm not the real professor. The real professor is somewhere else, right? And that's not me feeling like the professor doesn't fully define me as a subject. No, it's that as a subject, I'm not adequate to that symbolic identity. I can't rise to the level of that symbolic identity. And I think it's especially true if anyone's been a parent. Like I constantly think like, father, wait, that's what that guy was for me. It's not what I am relative to my kids, right? So there's no, I feel like I don't meet, I'm inadequate to that symbolic identity, and that divorce. So it doesn't really matter if is subjectivity inadequate to the identity, or is the identity inadequate to the subject, because the point is there's a disjunction between the two, and that disjunction is what creates the lacking being. That's why subjectivity is lacking, because it can't coincide with itself in any kind of symbolic identity. I think that's the really key thing. I wanted, as an example for this, I'd like to play out, think about a certain play I hope everybody knows. I chose it because I thought everyone would know it, Hamlet. So Hamlet, and especially Hamlet's own status in the play. So he starts out the play, and Claudius, his first appearance in the play is not in Act 1, Scene 1, it's in the second scene. And Claudius is putting on this big show. He talks to some other people. It's a lot of audiences there. And then I think it's the Kenneth Branagh version in 1996 of the film version of the play does a really good job of showing how Hamlet is off to the side, outside of the regular symbolic network. And Claudius turns to Hamlet and he says, "And now my cousin, my son." So cousin is sort of a term for my kinsman. And then he says, "My son," and of course that really riles Hamlet the wrong way, because he doesn't yet know that Claudius has killed his father, but he knows Claudius has married his mother pretty quickly after his father died, and that rubs him the wrong way, Freud thinks, because he has an Oedipal desire for his mother. But regardless, he's not too happy that Claudius is leapt into the seat of king of Denmark. And so Claudius looks at him, calls him, and then Hamlet says an interesting thing. He says, this first line Hamlet says in the play, he says a little, and it's an aside, it's not to, I think that's important, it's not to the whole anyone within the theatrical scene itself. He says a little more than kin and less than kind. I'm going to think about that for a second. So a little more than kin, he's saying, well, Claudius is maybe too close to, he's gotten too close to me because he's married my mother. So that part is pretty clear. And then he says, and less than kind. And I think he's punning on the word kind here to mean it's not really kind. He's not a kind guy. I don't like him, but also kind in the sense of what kind of thing is it? And what he's saying is, I'm different in kind from Claudius. And so what he's doing is trying to distinguish himself, I think, from his symbolic identity. He's saying there's just a failure to conjoin between what I am as a subject and what my symbolic identity is. And then throughout the play, of course, it's famous for Hamlet's questioning, and then there's all this commentary on why does Hamlet delay and not kill Claudius right away, right? And even Freud's thesis for that is he can't kill Claudius because Claudius has done what he wishes he could do. But I think it's important to see Hamlet as a subject of lack. And I think he's one of the best examples of how lack works in structuring our desire, which I think it's why it's not surprising that when Lacan goes to theorize how desire works, this is in the seminar 6 called Desire and Its Interpretation, he has 10 sessions on Hamlet. So he really makes Hamlet a central focus of that seminar, because he thinks that Hamlet reveals the structure of our desire in a way that maybe few other examples have done. And I think what's interesting is people often that talk about psychoanalysis like to use Antigone's example for the ethics of desire, because Lacan himself will use her as an example in the seminar Ethics of Psychoanalysis the subsequent year, just after Desire and Its Interpretation. But I think Hamlet is a better figure of desire because of this, because so Hamlet written in 1600, dawn of modernity. Hamlet, I think, expresses, and I think this is what Lacan was onto and why he focused on it, expresses lacking subjectivity and the relationship, the way in which lack is desire, better than maybe any literary figure, certainly up until that time, but maybe even subsequently. Because what does Hamlet do? His questioning is an insistence. So it's not just this, I think one of the readings of Hamlet is, so I think Freud's reading, this hysterical questioning. He just doesn't want to take up, he doesn't want to act, so he's just questioning, delay. But I think that's not, to me, that's not right. To me, that what Hamlet does is he acts through his posing of questions to his symbolic mandate. So he gets a mandate. So I mentioned this early scene from where Claudius calls him his son and really gives him a symbolic mandate. But then in the subsequent scene, in Act 1, he gets another, so he does it, this mandate from Claudius, it's pretty easy for him to reject. But then in the subsequent scene, as everyone knows, he gets a mandate from his father. And I think this one is much more difficult to reject, because the father's saying, look, prove yourself to be a real son, avenge my most foul and awful murder, and kill Claudius, right? So Hamlet doesn't do it. I mean, eventually he does it, but he doesn't do it immediately. It's like, well, wait a minute, how am I sure that this ghost is really my father and not just some evil demon set out to deceive me, right? And send me down the wrong path. And that kind of question is a question of lack. That is a question of desire. Because what he's saying is, I do not experience myself as equal to the symbolic mandate given to me by the dead father. So the figure of authority par excellence is the figure of the dead father. That's Freud insists on that, Lacan insists on that. So I think it's not an accident that in Hamlet we have the figure of the dead father saying, take up your symbolic mandate. He's the figure of authority. He's the one commanding Hamlet, telling him what to do. And Hamlet doesn't reject it, but he also doesn't just do it. And I think that's a really, really important aspect of the play. And I think that's what connects it to this relationship that I'm going to emphasize between subjectivity and symbolic identity. So by not saying, yeah, okay, I'm just going to do it no matter what, Hamlet evinces the gap between subjectivity and symbolic identity. And as long as that gap exists, he can't just do the thing that his father commands him to do. right? So if there's a gap between subjectivity and symbolic identity, we're in a gray area. We're not able to just go follow the symbolic mandate and do what's expected of us. Like his father says, look, prove yourself to be a proper son. And son, again, is a symbolic category that Hamlet doesn't, he's not sure if he is a proper son, because he's not sure if this symbolic authority is a proper authority. So the question of lack and in relationship to symbolic identity is always, I think, the basis for any political step that the subject can make. That if you're not, and I think Hamlet nicely shows this, that if you're not aware of or in touch with, and aware of can be unconsciously, you don't have to be consciously aware of, but in touch with your subjectivity and this failure to be your symbolic identity, then you're never going to be a politicized being. That not being, not coinciding with your symbolic identity, that is lacking, is the basis for how you can act against all the things that are given to you by the social symbolic structure. So certain mandates are given to me. How can I possibly act against them? Well, only by realizing that I'm not the equivalent, that relative to this mandate, I'm a lacking being. I want to touch on the end of Hamlet really quickly, because I think we see him undergo a trajectory, and this might be true, that he ends up actually giving up this questioning and conforming to what his father demands of him. So in the final, this is not the final act of the play, Act 5, Scene 1, he famously jumps into Ophelia's grave when he's devastated. He finds out she's dead, and he says, "This is I," very important line, "This is I, Hamlet the Dane." And a couple things about that. So he's avowing his symbolic identity. He's saying, I am this thing. I am this is his name. I am Hamlet. And to say you're the Dane means to say you're the associated with the throne. So it's basically laying down a challenge to Claudius, saying, no, I'm really the figure of the leader of Denmark, not you. So the thing that he rejected doing in the first scene, and that he rejected doing when his father mandates him to take up this, or he questioned doing it, here he assumes it totally. And thus he's able, in the scene of the play, to act and kill Claudius. Although so one way you could look at this is he's integrated his own status as a lacking subject into a certain symbolic mandate. So it could be that he's just finally conformed, and thus he's just doing whatever happens in every revenge tragedy. At the end, he just kills he accomplishes the revenge. But I think because of what happens earlier, that cannot be true. So there's still, I think, when Hamlet acts in the end, he's able to have a symbolic identity. And I think this is maybe the ultimate lesson of the play. And I think it overlaps with the ultimate lesson of psychoanalysis, that it can never be about just abandoning symbolic identity altogether. So the fact that one is a lacking subject doesn't mean, oh, I never have to worry myself with any kind of symbolic mandate. I exist outside of that. My lack it means that I can never be tied down to any kind of symbolic identity. I don't think that's the case. I think that what it means is that one has to adopt a symbolic identity and recognize the way in which that symbolic identity is itself lacking. That is, there's a kind of contradiction or incompletion within the symbolic identity. And that's why it's even possible for you to identify with it. So if an identity, and I think this is one of the things we think about identity, one of the ways we're deceived by identity is that we think, oh, there is someone who really occupies that identity. I'm sure everyone has had this thought. I just said it earlier when I was talking about my father. There's someone who really filled out the identity of father. I'm just a pretender. Or there's someone who really is a theorist. I'm just a pretender at it. There's someone who really is a professor. I'm a faker. So what Hamlet realized at the end is that, no, actually, anyone who ascends to this position of their name and their symbolic position of authority, they do it as a faker. They do it as a fraud. And I think that's that the notion of lack, that one of the transitions that occurs through psychoanalytic process is that one recognizes that not just lack isn't just on the side of subjectivity, but it's actually within the identity itself. And that's why it's possible for someone to take up an identity. Then if an identity really was itself whole, then it would be foreign to everybody and no one would have a chance to take it up. So the point is, again, not to say I'm insisting on subjectivity against symbolic identity, but I am going to recognize lack not only in myself as a subject, but in every possible identity that I might take up, which means not that I'm not going to take it up, but that I'm going to take it up while engaging with it and recognizing that it's just another position of lack within a series of a position of lack akin to my own lacking subjectivity. So that symbolic identity in this process loses its luster, one might say, that it becomes possible for us to see the way in which there's a way in which lack is both in the subject and in the identity, and that lack is the thing that holds the two together. So that I think ultimately for psychoanalysis, there's no way of thinking outside of lack or thinking outside the problematic of lack, even if we're thinking in terms of symbolic identities. So the lack that divides subjectivity finds itself duplicated in any symbolic identity that the subject takes up. So ultimately there's a reduction of one side to the other side, that you find yourself within. And I think that then you're able to not just to take up a symbolic mandate, and not just to take up a symbolic mandate and keep some distance from it, but to see the way in which the mandate itself has to relate to, it only has its whatever worth or power it has through its relationship to the larger symbolic structure, and then through its ultimate contradiction and self-negation. And so you see it in this way, I think the symbolic identity ceases to provide any kind of assurance. And I think that's the point, that if we follow this line of thinking based on lack, there's no point at which we can find solace or which we can rest on. And again, to come back to this idea of the distinction between loss and lack, loss allows us to find solace in an idea that there's some point outside of loss. Maybe this point that I initially had, maybe someone else who doesn't suffer from loss, maybe some social structure that doesn't. But once you think in terms of lack has to be structurally ubiquitous. And I think that's to me, that's the real contribution of psychoanalytic thinking to the understanding how society and subjectivity works. Thanks.
All right, fantastic, Todd. I just wanted to introduce you to my childhood teddy bear here.
Oh, cool.
Who's been with me from the beginning. And for some reason, I always have some fears around, am I ever going to lose it? am I ever going to lose my, how could I replace my childhood teddy bear?
Yeah, I don't think
I just have to confront the see from the lack perspective as opposed to the
teddy bear is lacking. Yes, there you go.
Yeah. I'm already lacking. The teddy bear doesn't. I've already lost the teddy bear. No, but no, that was great. I just wanted to. I think there's a few things I wanted to run off with you there, but
sure.
But one of them, I think it's so important that you emphasize there towards the end of your presentation is that what's at stake in sort of the direction you're taking, Lac, is sort of seeing contradiction inherent to the symbolic itself.
Right.
And I think this is a move where there's a lot at stake here. I've had some conversations with a student at Philosophy Portal about how in Eastern spiritual traditions, there is a capacity to see contradiction as inherent in existence or being, but there's a difficulty in seeing contradiction as inherent to the concept, or contradiction as inherent to the symbolic. And what do you think philosophically might be at stake in this move from thinking not just being is contradictory, but concepts are contradictory, and yet that doesn't mean we can just withdraw from concepts?
Right. I mean, I think that's, to me, that's the essential. I mean, this isn't psychoanalysis so much; it's the essential Hegelian move, right? That, and I think I understand why people don't think this, but it seems to me once you think about it, it's pretty, like what you're saying is pretty clear, right? Like, because what does a concept do? A concept says A equals B, let's say, right? So it is already saying, it's already connecting things that are different and saying these things that are different are the same, right? So I think that I mean, Hegel's point is that is contradictory, right? And I think what's at stake in it is that I think the point is not to give any, this is what you were saying, not to give oneself any place where you're not beset by that problem of contradiction, right? And I think so it's funny. I think that's an interesting thing, that I think that recognizing the contradiction in the concept is maybe easier for some people, but then I think for other people, like there's a whole obvious tradition in the West of complete rejection of Hegel because it's just nonsense. There can't be a contradiction in being itself, right? So that seems to me fascinating, that that you can try to avoid contradiction on either side, either conceptually or, let's say, ontologically. But I think, to me, I can understand the rejection of, like, being can't be contradictory. That makes sense to me. The other one is a little harder to understand because I don't know what a concept would be that didn't include otherness in some kind of way. And then that seems to me pretty obviously, I mean, you could say, I don't want to call that contradiction, but okay, right. But then it seems like to me, you're playing a semantic game then, because I do think it's saying these things that seem disparate are the same. That's what concepts do, right? Like even the concept of causality is saying, oh, this one thing and this other thing one causes the other, but it's saying, you think these two things are disparate, actually there's something that holds them together. And I think that there's something contradictory about that, any kind of thinking in those terms.
No, absolutely. And I think, in order to get at some of the, I suppose, performative contradictions that I think result from this, like my favorite performative contradictions, I think, are, say, for example, the just coming to my mind, the Buddhist monk who's writing a best-selling book, for example. Yeah. Like, you say meditation is the silence and the withdrawal is the thing, but then you're writing a book, you're giving speeches, you maybe have a YouTube channel, and you're engaging in the symbolic. And in order to sort of get at this contradiction, I just want to tell a very brief story and then connect it back to what you're saying. Is when I was coming to the end of my doctorate, simultaneously, I was coming to, I think, the personal reality of the symbolic contradiction in regards to the way I was conceiving, the way you were talking about, let's say, an ideal professor or an ideal symbolic mandate, which right. had been driving me and I've been taking up. And actually, I immediately fell into thinking about and exploring Lac. And I think that, like, just in my life, and and I think where I am now with thinking about this is that when you're day to day thinking with the symbolic contradiction, I think there's a lot of cool things that can come out of that, but you also have to, in some sense, befriend processes that involve suffering and pain and negative emotions. And I just want to get your feedback on, do you think this is a not just my experience with the doctorate, but do you think this is a symptom within our institutions as such, that people are coming to this realization of the symbolic mandate? And what do you see in this regard?
Well, I mean, I think it's a symptom of every. I mean, symptom sounds negative. Like, I think if the institution's able to allow people to come to that recognition, then all the better. But I think the problem is that I think it's not. I think we're led to believe that there's some kind of problem if we don't feel equal to the symbolic mandate. Like for instance, writing a job letter. I remember doing this because my dissertation director said to me, "You've spent more time on your job letter than Rilke spent on the Duino elegies." And he goes, "That's a very sad thing." And I thought that was really funny. And it devastated me when he said that. Although he wasn't saying I shouldn't do it. But I think the point is, I was trying to get, like, how can I thought, well, there's a way I can do it. I can present myself as equal to the symbolic mandate. And that's the goal of this whole process. So I think the problem with the institution is that it doesn't allow for that. It doesn't privilege that insight that you had and that experience that you had with it. I would say, I like this idea. I mean, your Buddhist monk example is good. And there's a Lacan example that is exactly the same, right? So I think it's printed, I know it's printed at the end of seminar 17. It's this little encounter. Lacan gave a talk at Vincennes, it's University of Paris 8, Paris 8. And he goes to give a talk, and the students end up disrupting the talk and creating havoc, and he can't finish. And someone goes, "Look, we don't need you to come in here and talk to us. We know exactly what we got to do. We got to leave the university." And Lacan goes, "That's great, except you got to go in to tell the people to leave." And he goes, "That's the whole issue." And the guy goes, "That's not the issue at all. That's no problem." and he, like, it's clear that for Lacan, like, that is the central contradiction, right? Like, if you're telling people to, if you're saying to people to leave the university, why don't you yourself leave the university first, right? But the person didn't do that. So I think that's that idea of that fundamental contradiction of any symbolic position, that seems to me manifested in that. And I think we live in a world of I think this idea of opting out is very attractive to people. But I think what you have to see is the way in which you're dependent on the thing you're opting out from. And so that's again this contradiction within that. Even if you opt out, you're still lacking subject. And I think even if you're opt out, you're still dependent on that symbolic identity. And so that's what I like about the last act of Hamlet, is that he's finding a way to try to reconcile himself as lacking to that lacking symbolic identity.
Yeah, it's a great example of this paradox of, the one who doesn't have, I certainly do have that feeling of wanting to opt out, but I always catch myself in that emotion and try to recognize the contradiction into it. It just reminds me of this story. There's this video on YouTube of a man who's lived on an isolated island in Japan for, I don't know, 10, 15 years. But the funny thing about the story is that he needs his sister to send out some supplies to him every month in order so he can still live on the island by himself in pure isolation. So he's still dependent on his sister in order to be completely isolated, which I think is an interesting little flip there.
Well, no, Cadell, wouldn't you say that if someone was
yeah.
completely isolated, we would never know it?
Exactly. Yeah. No,
right. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like,
this was
once
the
we
motivation.
know someone's isolated, they're not isolated.
Yeah. Okay, so there's something, when I was rewatching our conversation earlier in the year, one of the things that stuck out to me was one of your criticisms of Lacan claiming that he got his knowledge primarily from his patients or his the subjects he was analyzing. And you were saying, that's not true. He was very well read. He read a lot of philosophy, a lot of literature. And I was just reading this morning a passage from Lacan where he's talking about a case where he was talking about a specific patient he had. And he was saying that the patient's outburst reminded him of a certain figure of literature that he had been reading. And I just wanted to get your feedback on this idea of, could it be a combination that Lacan's knowledge came from both a deep understanding of literature and philosophy and mixing it with studying patience? Is it a combination of both, or do you think there's some relation between the two?
No, yeah, I think yeah, I don't have any, I think that's probably exactly right. You know, but I think that here's what I would say. If you didn't have a framework to have the empirical experience of the patients, then that experience would be meaningless. Right. So that's the only thing I would say. Like, I don't think,
Yeah, I
I
like
don't
that
think
point.
there's some kind, I guess, I think
So he's
William
constantly
Lacan-
name dropping Hegel. He's constantly name dropping,
I know.
like all he's obscenely well read. It's
I know.
my what dominant experience reading Lacan is, how is he this well read?
And in fact, so much so that I think it's in Seminar too. He says, you know, there's a certain way of complimenting me. And he goes, I don't really like it at all. It's saying like, you're so cultivated, you're so cultured. And he's like, look, and then he has this funny line. He says, the only difference between me and you is, he's talking to all the people in the seminar. He says, even though I might not have been around for 200 years like an English lawn, but I'm getting close. So he's, you know, I think that he downplays it, but I think you're right. Like I think he's incredibly, and he was so intimate with Alexander Kojève in these seminars on Hegel, and not just taking the seminar, but having Kojève over to his house for an additional meeting every week. So I think he just, in terms of his learning, I think he's incredible. But I would just say that, yeah, I think that that learning allows him to things to be said in the analytic session that push it even for more forward. I absolutely think that's right.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that was coming to my mind when you were presenting was, and specifically on this relationship you're setting up between subjectivity and the symbolic, is, I mean, here's two questions really, is, should we be thinking about lack as the real? And then on the other hand, the question is, how should we think about subjectivity and language in regards to what Lacan says as the unconscious is structured like a language, so these two questions.
Yeah, I think so. The first one, I do think that the lacking subject touches the real, right? Like the lacking, I mean, obviously you're not fully, because you always have a symbolic identity. So you're never fully like, I mean, I don't think there is such a thing as being fully in the real, but I think to be a lacking subject, you're experiencing the gaps within the symbolic order. That's what Lacan calls the real. So absolutely for that. The second thing, it's interesting because I think sorry, could you repeat that question? I'm sorry, the second question.
So it was so you answered the lack as the real, but then when you were setting up the relationship between subjectivity and the symbolic, how should we think about Lacan's axiom of the unconscious is structured like a language?
Yeah, I don't know why I totally spaced on that, because that's not my favorite axiom. But I think that I think so. He said, where does he say it? He says it's important that I don't say the unconscious is language, but I say it's structured like a language. And I think it's to say that is to say that one connects to it through relationships between signifiers. But I think what's unconscious is precisely the gap between the signifier. I mean, clearly one signifier could be unconscious for someone, right? They always trip up on the same word. Like I always trip up on this maxim from Lacan, but that doesn't, but it's still, that's a gap within the chain of signification. So I think that's the way I've always thought about it. And I think that, I'm not sure about this, but it seems to me that Lacan's thought evolves on this question. So the little axiom stays the same, but I think that it has some form even in the earliest seminars, not exactly the same formulation that he makes later, but it's one of the ones that remains pretty. I think the first time he says it, just unconscious is structured like a language, is seminar 11, but he says certain things like that are close to that as early as seminar 2 and seminar 1. But I think that what he means by it changes, because I think this is debatable, but it seems to me like what he means by it early on is just, there are certain signifiers that determine our being and we're not conscious of them. But later, I think he'll say, what we're not conscious of is a certain gap within the signifying chain. And I think that's change is a change in how he conceives of the real. So when he says real in seminars 1 and 2, he just means reality. And then when he says real in by seminars 8, I think, seminars 9, he means this cut in the signification this thing that can't be signified within the symbolic order. And there's much more of a sense of the knotting of symbolic, imaginary, real. So I don't know, that's what I would say about that.
All right. The other thing that I wanted to really get to that stuck out to me, and this is something that I just always scratch my head about, is, and it's again when it's really I really like the conclusions, and just want to compliment you a little bit on how you were using Hamlet. I thought that was really good, and the conclusions you came through from that I thought were really, really, they hit hard for me. Was you said sort of the point is that anyone who ascends to their name or position of authority, they do it as a fake or a fraud. And then I wanted to ask, in the light of like sort of Lacan saying truth has a structure of a fiction, is there such thing as a true fraud versus just a fraud? Like to me, like, I don't know, I just run into this issue of how to think the difference between someone who's I intuitively think that he's fraudulent, he's a fraud, he's like literally lying, or like he's just contradictory so I don't know if I want to say non-productive way, but someone who is a true fraud, someone who's I'm not like the guy, I'm not the thing, but I'm trying to somehow be true in my fraudulency.
Yeah, I think that isn't the difference that the true fraud doesn't have reference to an ideal of truth outside of the fake, right? Like I think that the person who's a conscious liar, and I think this is Hegel's point about crime. I think it's a really interesting point he makes about crime. He's like, and of course, whatever, people, if they need to steal because they don't have enough to eat, that's not what he's talking about. But the person who like Tony Soprano, the person who dedicates themselves to crime, they're always doing it with a hidden reference and reverence even for law. And I think the person who actively lies, actively contradicts themselves intentionally, is doing it with this hidden reference to an ideal of truth that's outside of the fakery, right? And I think to me, that's what it'd be a true fake would be someone that does it without this reference to the outside. And so it seems to me like that distinction works pretty well. And I think that you can even, like, Trump would be the obvious example, right? Like this contradicting himself constantly, but isn't it to avoid the recognition that he's the subject of contradiction, right? Because like his obvious contradictions hold up this ideal of, they actually support an ideal of non-contradiction, rather than like I'm trying to be non-contradictory, and thus I'm revealing in that way what Hegel would call the Wirklichkeit, the actuality of contradiction, right? So I think that to me is how I would think about that the attempt to lie, the attempt to be the open contradiction has a secret reference to the ideal of non-contradiction.
All right. I think the last major question I want to ask before we open up for questions, and everyone who's here, I know there's a few questions that have been left in the chat, but we're going to have an hour to go through all these questions. So just make a note if you do want to ask one. Is I know you're also, interested and an expert in film, cinema, culture studies. You're obviously a professor in cultural studies, and you sort of put Hamlet on a pedestal, not only in terms of the history in relationship to maybe ancient literature or something like that, but also modern literature. And I wanted to ask, are there any either books or movies from the 19th or the 20th century which you would put on par with Hamlet, or you would say are in the orbit, or in just because I think now I want to make a list of some of the books that I really want to study on this topic of desire and lack.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're right. I probably over idealize Hamlet a little bit, but I don't think it's on its own. I think that, 20th century. So I would just I would think about, like, I think Magic Mountain does a great job of showing the way in which Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, the way that we're necessarily subjects of lack and that symbolic interpolation always fails in some way. I think Toni Morrison's Beloved is one of the great examples of this. Like, it's all about how is rejecting one's symbolic mean? I think Morrison, even more than Hamlet, I think Morrison shows the way in which rejecting one's symbolic mandate it's inherently a political act. So I think the political dimension in Hamlet, maybe because he ultimately does what his father tells him to do, I think it's maybe a little bit more inapparent, but I think it's much more apparent in Beloved. So those would be two. In terms of films, I would say there's some great films that are about how a certain kind of at the core, I can't accede to this symbolic identity because it's self-contradictory, self-negating, lacking. One of my favorite ones is Memento. So Memento, you think we're headed back to, the film goes backwards, so it's going back in time. Half of it goes back in time. And you think you're going back to discover a truth, and then what you really discover is a fiction. And I think, I'm not going to give anything more away than that, but I think that's, to me, a great example of it. The other one this probably for me has the status of Hamlet, is Fight Club. I think Fight Club just does this great job of connecting the failure of identity and lack in identity, like Morrison, I think, to clear political project. Finally, the other one, I just think of Fight Club, because I often compare it to this. I think it's similar in terms of its ambition, is Sergei Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin, which I think it's the only film ever made with a collective hero. Like, I think it's almost impossible to make a film with a collective hero, but I think Potemkin does that. Oh, finally, the other one I have to mention is Citizen Kane, which I think does this also. Is about this distinction between lack and loss. And I think it's very easy to read Citizen Kane because it seems like he's lost a certain object. It's very easy to read it as, this is a story about the horror of loss. And Wells himself even said it's dollar book Freud, as in, oh, he's lost something about the mother and now he's constantly. But I don't think that. I think he was playing around. I think there's something. I think it's much more about, no, he's a subject of lack, and this is about the structure of desire and how that feeds into and gets written over by the structure of capitalism. So those would be some examples that come to mind.
Fantastic. So I've got from the authority of Todd McGowan, Fight Club is on the level of Hamlet. I like that. I
would say that. Yeah. Although it's interesting. So Wells said we should never ever compare a film to Shakespeare. So from Wells himself, we should not put that. But I would put it up.
Okay. Well, Wells says that, but McGowan says, that.
Come on. That's ridiculous.
All right. So for everyone here, this has been, again, the second seminar on the Écrits with Lack and Desire, and we've got an hour for questions and comments. So I know there's been a lot of questions in the chat, so we'll start with Andrew, and then we'll move from there.
Thank you for letting me go first. Great lecture, Todd. Really good to see you again. I really enjoyed the clarification on the difference between loss and lack. And one of the things that stood out was when you said that not only do we lack, thus we desire to constantly get into our symbolic identity, but even the sort of symbolic identity lacks itself. And I want to know if this is kind of comparable to Slavoj's reading in For They Know Not What They Do, on the one with the homology between the logic of the signifier and the law of identity in Hegel, and that no matter what, it's always an inversion. It's not that it's just lack, it's an inversion. So we could say our striving for a symbolic identity is it becomes inverted as our ego ideal. And it even becomes more relevant that we invert it with your notion of the phallus and the joke that you made in the Paradigms of Jouissance of the Watchtower.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Andrew. It's great. It's a great point that the symbolic structure, you're right. It's not just lacking. It's a really good clarification. It's not just lacking, but it inverts everything, right? So I think that if you, which means that if you get, and I think this is why I'm melding psychoanalysis and Hegel, but I think they're melded anyway. That's why if you strive for recognition, you can't. You're also striving to not be recognized. So there's a way in which everything ends up. Once it's in the symbolic hamper, it ends up becoming its opposite. And I think it's really just a crucial point. The only thing I would say about this, I just want to tell another little joke. This is one so I'm stealing it from Slavoj, but he stole it from Alenka, who I don't know who she took it from. So, and I think this is about the lack within the other, right? So a guy goes to into psychoanalysis because he thinks he's a seed, and he can't go out because he's worried that a chicken might eat him, and he's constantly fearing that. And so he goes through psychoanalysis, everything works, and it comes to the end of it after, I don't know, 6 months. And he finally recognizes he's not a seed. And so he feels like, okay, now I can go out in public. And then comes back to the psychoanalyst the very next day. And he's like, oh, I'm everything collapsed. I'm not cured at all. And the analyst goes, what's wrong? You've come to the realization that you're not a seed. And the guy goes, yeah, I got it. But I'm not sure if the chicken knows. So you see, this is the idea that I still find that funny even after I've heard it like 100 times. That the idea is that it's the other. I have to come to the recognition that the other is lacking too, that the symbolic identity, wherever it is also lacking. And I think that's the key. It's in a way the key gesture, because everyone's acquainted intimately with their own lack.
Did you want to respond to that, Andrew?
Oh, no. That was definitely perfect, especially the point about the other is also lacking. So it's not only that I lack, but the other lacks as well, which I think is like a point that we've been touching on with the last lecture with Peter Rollins. He pointed that out with the notion of God. It's like, does God know that he lacks as well? Is the real question.
Right. I think that for most believers, God doesn't know. I mean, that's the key, right? That God doesn't know. And so all the ritual is done to sustain that God doesn't know that God is lacking. Right. I think, yeah.
I think the last thing I would say though is like, does that mean like we may not come to the realize that our identity in the symbolic lacks because of like the insistence of the superego attachment to it?
Yeah. No, Andrew, it's such a great point. I think that's right. And to me, that's the force that is constantly working again. I think the superego is on the side of loss and not lack, right? Like it's trying to convince us that we're a subject of loss and not a subject of lack. And so don't be reconciled to lack. The other is out there somewhere really complete or really full, right? And I'm going to constantly, that's what the superego, the ideal that it holds up to us and that we're failing to get to.
All right, Max.
Thank you very much, Todd. That was very interesting. Where do you think grief and fear fit into loss and lack?
I think, yeah, those are two separate, totally different things, right? So I think grief or mourning is our response to lack being lost, right? I have a friend who just died recently. Like I'm still destroyed by that, and I don't think I ever will not be. But that grief is not because it's not relative to just my everyday lack or anybody's everyday lack, right? It's relative to the loss of a lack, right? Like I think that's to me that's what grief is. That grief, it really concerns loss. It doesn't concern lack, and that when we grieve someone, we're grieving their loss and the loss of them as a lacking subject. So that's how I would think about that. Fear, I think fear doesn't get enough discussion in psychoanalytic circles because it gets so, anxiety gets privileged and fear gets thought of as, and this is philosophically too, like Heidegger, there's this whole fear is just everyday, anxiety is something, there's something authentic about it. I think even Freud kind of does this in his anxiety book, but I think that for me, what fear is fear is the confrontation with what something that forces us to confront ourselves as a lacking being, right? So if I have fear makes myself aware of my lack. I think anxiety, at least as Lacan defines it, is something that where my lack gets stifled, like it gets covered over, right? Like I get, for Lacan, anxiety is this confrontation with too much. And I think, but what I like about fear as a revelatory emotion, not that I like feeling afraid, I hate feeling afraid, is that it all of a sudden my status as a lacking subject comes to the fore, and that I'm vulnerable. I feel like I'm in crisis, and that I recognize myself as a lacking being. So I think that's how I would think about the role of fear.
So anxiety is an overwhelming, but is fear seems to be very related to that too.
Yeah, well, but the difference is that I think fear is related to, so anxiety for Lacan is when I'm not sure, I'm not even saying I accept this definitions, but there's a couple there. But for Lacan, anxiety is, I'm confronted with, I expected there to be a lack in the other, and then instead there's this fullness. So his example is, the mother's always on the baby's ass. She's even wiping your butt, right? So that idea that there's too much presence, over presence. I don't think that's fear. I think fear is like, I'm afraid of disappearing, right? Like I'm afraid of all of a sudden my lack is I'm confronted with it. Whereas in anxiety, I think you're not as much confronted, or you're not at all confronted with yourself as lack. That lack feels like it's filled.
So
that's how Lacan would differentiate.
Fear is a confrontation with death.
I think so.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, again, that would be controversial, because for someone like Heidegger, it's precisely anxiety in the face of death. But I don't think that's right. I think fear, and this is by the way why Freud thought he wasn't so concerned with fear, because he thought we never are really afraid. He didn't believe in fear of death, Freud. He thought, and he says this multiple places, he thought fear of death is always really anxiety about castration. So I think that, but I would say, no, there's really a fear of death. And I think that's in contrast to anxiety.
Thanks, that's very helpful. I think you're on the right track.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
If Max thinks you're on the right track, you're going somewhere, Todd.
Good. I appreciate it.
Dimitri, are you with us?
I have one. Oh, sorry. I have one question. It's just a small question, and then I have a follow-up question, depending on your answer, actually.
Okay.
So, lacking subjectivity, is this a symbolic identification in itself or not?
Yeah, that's a complex question, isn't it? Because in a certain sense, we're talking about it, or I'm talking about it. I'm giving it a symbolic designation. So yeah, but it's our symbolic way of talking about what doesn't fit within the symbolic. And this comes back to actually Andrew's point about the way in which the symbolic turns everything around, right? And turns everything upside down. That when I try to designate what can't be designated, I designate it, right? So I'm always flipping the thing into what the opposite of what I want to say. But I think there is a way to notice that. And I think that's subject of lack is just a name for the failure that occurs within the symbolic order, right? So it's not, so yeah, it is if we think about it if we think about it as we're just talking, yeah, of course, it's a symbolic designation. It's not, like those are words. Those are 3 words. They're not symbolic, but it's a way within the symbolic of designating what the symbolic can't cover, right? Doesn't account for. I mean, Lacan's name for that is real, right? Real, like you could say to Lacan, well, wait a minute, pal. Real is already a signifier. So it's not, that's just symbolic. But he would say, well, there's a precise name for that kind of objection, and it's cynicism, right? Like you're saying, oh, you can't really say anything because it always just turns into its opposite. But the point is, you're able to, it's not this meta-linguistic operation, you're able to, within language, designate this point of failure within that language comes to. So that's a good question, but that is I just say there's a difference between articulating a symbolic identity like whatever professor and articulating subject of lack, which is about the failure within the symbolic.
Okay, and my follow-up question, which is related to what Max was saying, is that the way you structure this presentation, Freud had a paper called Mourning and Melancholia, right? So really, if you can theorize lack, then you're on the path to mourn. Whereas the melancholic does not want to get rid of the semblance of loss, let's say, right? That's why it refuses to mourn. Whereas if you actually think lack through, you're in the process of mourning and accepting that there was no such loss, no such object to lose in the first place.
Right, Dimitri, it's a great point. It's a great point that
I still have a question.
okay, but let me just comment on this because I
go.
just want to clarify what you're saying. I mean, not that what you said wasn't clear, but I just think you could say subject of loss, subject of lack, melancholia, and mourning, right? Like I think that's exactly right. They kind of line up with that.
Yeah. So and it's a coincidence because I've been thinking about it for a few days, and I do agree that it's like pedagogically a great starting point to theorize this. However, can we ever really get rid of loss? Can we really get rid of this melancholia? It seems that like even though we consciously think lack, that loss will always slip in here and there. And now I think this is basically kind of like the paradoxical nature of Hegel's getting at, that also like kind of foreshadows object A. There's a small quote I want to say here by Hegel in Encyclopedic Logic. He says, "The accomplishing of the infinite purpose consists therefore in sublating the illusion that it has not yet been accomplished." So it's basically a reconciling with that concrete universality of the failing symbolic identification. So what are your thoughts about this? And like, can we ever get fully rid of loss?
Yeah,
you know?
no, I think you're right. I think you're right that you can't, and I think this is why nostalgia has such a incredible power over us, right? Because there's no way, I don't think you can finally I think this idea of loss always looms. And I think the reason is because we are subjects of lack, that I think that there's something in being a lacking subject that is generative of the illusion of loss. And I don't think you can get out of that. So I think I think it's good that you referred to Hegel, because Hegel's point always is the misrecognition is essential. Like you can't get out of the misrecognition, right? Like you can't. So I would just say that about loss too, but the trajectory, that's why I think the trajectory is through our conception is to move from thinking about subject of loss to thinking about subject of lack as the starting point. And then you can see the idea of loss as this way of trying to, as a refusal of subject of lack, right? So I think that, yeah, but I totally agree with you that it's not ultimately overcomable, that idea.
Dimitri, do you have any more hysterical provocations for Todd? No.
No, that's enough for today. But yeah, I mean, I think this paradoxical idea of what is really the end of analysis, and this impossibility to get rid of jouissance in whatever way possible, to get rid of this crack of the real that always slips in somewhere, is really mind-boggling to me always.
Okay. Ryan?
Hi, Todd.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I think this is actually pretty related to Dimitri's question. So I'm a person who identifies as non-binary, and I feel like that's an identity of non-identity. And I'm wondering how we like feel about that. Like, it almost feels like it is unable to escape the sort of identification with identification. Like there's a work to like sort of socially make it a like third gender,
Right.
even though it is intended as a non-gender in a certain way. And I'm just wondering how like how you feel and what you think about like identities of non-identity, and whether or not that like escaped something, or if it's still like trapped within sort of lacking.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think like the question is not if it escapes lack, is that it's trapped within the illusion of non-lacking, right? Like that would be the problem. I don't know about that. Like, I think I kind of like the idea of like non-identity as the identity, because then it's a way of foregrounding the failure of identity, right? So I think I do like that aspect, but I think the problem it runs through is what Andrew was talking about earlier, right? Like you try to assert the thing and you find out, oh, wait a minute, I've asserted the very opposite of what I meant to assert in the first place. And this is exactly what you're saying. I want to assert non-identity, and then I end up creating non-identity as an identity. But I think here's what I think. I think right now, it's interesting because the political fight seems to me to be, let's have non-identity recognized as a full identity, which is what you're saying. But I think the radicality of non-binary is precisely its an ability to fit as an identity. So I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I almost think it's too soon to know, right? Like, I think at a certain point, saying like, oh, both these identities fail, and I'm going to highlight that's a radical position, and it's a disruptive position. But maybe I don't think a person should be forced to occupy a radical position, because it's not necessarily a good position to be in, because there's violence or whatever, there's problems. But then once it becomes accepted as an identity, then I think it's just another identity. Like I don't have this. I don't think like two or three. Like if there can only be two identities, it's always no. I think there can be as many symbolic identities as there like. But I do think that what you're onto is really the key thing. Like, how does the actuality of non-identity, how can I integrate that into my identity itself? And I think in a way, that's what I was talking about with the Hamlet's problem. Like, I think you could say, well, in the beginning of the play, Hamlet he's identifying as non-binary, right? Like he's saying, I don't fit into this. I'm not your kind. Like I'm not your kind. I don't fit into any kind of position. And then at the end, he's trying to say, well, how can I reconcile that to a certain symbolic identity and certain symbolic destiny? And that, I think, is the problem. Like, I think that's the question of everyone's existence. Like, because I can't just reject it. Like, I think I can't, it would be nice if I could just say, oh, like the guy, Cadell, your point about the guy on the island, right? Like, you still got the parent, you still got the relative bringing you the food. Like, you still got the whole symbolic structure giving you the ammunition, right? So you can't just reject it. But on the other hand, you can't also fully accept it, because to do so would be to deny that you're a lacking subject. So I don't have a good answer to this, except to say that I don't think there's any. I think the radicality stays within this affirmation of the failure of identity. And if a certain identity becomes fully accepted, that's fine. I mean, I think that's good, actually. But then it loses that touch with that trouble in identity itself, right? Which I think, because I don't think there's any inherent trouble I don't think there's any inherent binary structure to identity. And I don't think there's any inherent necessary radicality to non-binary position, which again, I think that's good, because if there was, then it would be forever an oppressed position, right? So I think that that's what I would say, that there has to be a way to, whatever your position, to find this non-identity within, this failure within identity, and whatever the options we have, that should be highlighted in everyone. So I think one should say, like, one would be, it's interesting. I think that, like, one could say, no, I'm not a failure of identity. You're the failure. You who think you're a woman, you who think you're a man, you're the failure of identity, right? So I think that's the way that the political power of that position gets sustained in my mind, right?
Did you want to follow up, Ryan?
No, I thought that was relatively comprehensive. So thank you.
Oh, sure. It's a great question.
Chitan?
Hi, thanks for a wonderful talk. Actually, I've been thinking about the discussion between Nietzsche and Deleuze in that, and you referred to it in that sense. And one of the things I'm interested in the way Deleuze sort of activates Nietzsche against the Hegelian position, especially in his work, Nietzschean philosophy, where he says he's not against contradiction per se. His argument is not that contradiction itself is the problem. His argument is that contradiction is not the primary thing. And he makes a distinction between active and reactive forces in Nietzsche. And he says that till the point we remain within the domain of contradiction, we will remain in the domain of reactive forces in that sense. There has to be a substitution at the end of that force. It's a substitutive game. I don't know, if you've played with those kind of video games or those kind of movies where eventually you have to substitute one thing for the other. The whole thing will collapse. You pick the stone from there and you have to immediately keep something else, instead of that. It's something like that he sort of explores. And he says that practical element of difference has to be replaced by contradiction at the end of that. So his problem is not that there's no contradiction. His problem is that contradiction eventually has to be replaced by difference.
Right. I mean, or that I think he thinks the difference is primary, right? Like, I think
difference is primary, exactly.
Right. I think I think that's right, and I think that I think his fear is, and this is his accusation against Hegel, and especially in Nietzschean philosophy, but ubiquitous in his thought. His fear is that when you're talking about contradiction, you're actually privileging identity over difference. And I don't think that's right. Like, I think that Hegel's idea is that contradiction actually undermines identity from within prior to identity. And I mean, it's just, look, you finally just have to put your money down on whichever side you want, right? Like, it's not like I could sit here and argue with someone that loves Deleuze and say, look, can't you see contradiction has to be primary? I'm not going to win the argument. Like, they're not going to come over to my side. But I think that the idea is that for Deleuze, difference is like, yeah, contradiction can result, but difference is primary. Hegel thinks the problem is that doesn't, and this comes back to this, you have to go into the university to get them out, or you have to go, somebody has to come to the island to give you resource. Oh, that wasn't you, Cadell. Who said that? Was Andrew's thing, right? Yeah, sorry.
I mentioned the Japanese, the island.
Oh, that was you. Yeah, sorry. I thought you looked at me with I wasn't sure if you would say, sorry. Anyway, someone said, Cadell. Okay. But that, like, having to bring the supplies to the island or having to go into that is it seems to me like that is more on the side of there is this initial contradiction that then difference emerges out of, right? So that's because any assertion of difference, this is why Deleuze doesn't like representation, because any assertion of something is always going to involve the difference within contradiction, right? Difference is going to be implicated in contradiction once something gets asserted, which again is Andrew's point about this reversal that happens with the symbolic. So yeah, I don't know. I understand that Deleuze isn't totally against contradiction, but he is against making it primary, and he's against it because it has this tie, he thinks, to identity.
But actually, I get your point, and you're absolutely right. You know, he thinks difference is primary. That is why he sort of brings difference back in the end of that, you know, juncture. In fact, in the starting point, I think what is at stake in that primary nature difference is what happens in the end. That question of substitution. So my question actually is not about this. I know you're right. You know, you cannot convince either side one way or the other. But my question actually is that how do we think through this question of the active force of Deleuze? The way he's thinking about active force within the Hegelian or Lacanian thinking, that how do we find a space for this kind of an activity, a way in which a force can find its own end eventually, you know, that point, how do we think through that point within the Lacanian Hegelian, or Lacanian Hegelian thinking actually is trying to find its ground within the reactive force itself? Is that such a bad thing? So today we are trying to think in what way the alienation can be sort of actualized in some productive ways. You know, there is an argument for alienation that is emerging. So is that active force that Deleuze is trying to seek itself a fantasy, or is there something within that distinction that has to be still preserved within the Lacanian framework? That's, I think, one thing I wanted to sort of.
Yeah, I'm going to answer this in a very way you're going to find unsatisfying, I fear. I think it's a fantasy. I think that for my position, in fact, my newest book is called Embracing Alienation. So that would tell you the answer right there. I don't think that there's this term people use today, flourishing. Like, I don't think there's a Hegelian or psychoanalytic flourishing. I think there's only how do we take our negativity and make it productive, right? Like, I don't think there's any escape from reactivity. I don't think there's any escape from dialectics. I don't think that. So I think that one has to find the way in which one's own singularity is not opposed to that, but actually emerges out of that universality. So I think that's my answer. So
thank you so much. Thank you.
So we're not going to solve the Hegel Deleuze debate today.
Sorry.
I think we under delivered. I'm sorry, everyone. Hatim, is that how I pronounce your name? Just you're on mute. Yeah.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, hi. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. This is the first time for me. I'm from Sudan, but living now in UAE. And I'm not professional. I'm an engineer, but I have an interest in the philosophy. And for about many months, I'm following Cadell last for the phenomenology of spirit and Zizek, less than nothing. So I don't want to talk too much. I want to get into my questions. It might be simple, but I'm asking about the lack and the desire. The lack, for example, my understanding, the lack, for example, is related to the unconscious, and the desire is a conscious. This question and how this can be, and also at the same time, even the animals also has a lack and desire. Is this what about this and its relation to the Deleuze ideas about the passive synthesis, and when it become an active synthesis, and also in Hegel or Freud the unconscious, and if you remember the example of the time when the light, the human start to see the light from specific distance. So this is one question. And also because here we have in Africa have too much problems with the lack in the social movements and the desire, not from an individual perspective, not from social society. The whole society has a lack and has the desire. How this lack and desire forms within the society is the particularity of such society, and the difference between this society and the evolving of the lack and the desire, and how people captures or grasp this at some point and started to move. This is just my question, because we have too much problems. Our societies are different. The lack, many lacks, and the symbolic is different from other societies, from group societies. Is this my question? If it is clear for you.
Yeah, that's very clear. So the first question is about the relationship between lack and desire. Is that right? Hatim?
Yes, the lack and desire, the relation of the lack to the unconscious and the desire. If I desire, that means now it is I am conscious, and I am acting now.
Okay.
So,
Okay,
yeah.
I got you. Yeah, I got you. So I don't think, I actually don't, I think that, so I think it's, the second question is much more vast, but I think this question is, desire is unconscious. I think it's the same as lack. And then I think that I would just distinguish between what Freud calls in German Wunsch, like conscious wants, conscious wishes, and unconscious desire. And I think that it's a really interesting question, because I think that our conscious wishes and conscious wants strive for wholeness or strive for success, whereas our unconscious desire is constantly striving for another failure, to try to find ways into which to access, to sustain ourselves as lacking beings. So I think that's what I wouldn't distinguish between lack and desire. I would distinguish between lack, desire on one side, and then conscious want, conscious wish on the other side. That's what I would make that distinction. The question about the particularity of the symbolic, I think is a really important one. So different symbolic structures are different. What causes a symbolic structure to be oppressive, right? Or what causes a certain symbolic structure to be oppressed within a larger group of symbolic structures, right? I think there's a psychoanalytic theory about that. And that is, it's precisely this attempt to deny lack in oneself or in the other that creates a oppressive structure, right? And I don't think that's particular, right? I think that's, to me, that's a universe, like that, when that operation happens, then something oppressive, like, let's say colonialism, let's say patriarchy, like all those, like those oppressive structures are heteronormativity. Like those oppressive structures are precisely out of the attempt to deny lack, both in, let's say, within the whatever the dominant structure is itself, and within its other. So to me, precisely the avowal of the subject of lack, the subject of desire, that's part and parcel, that's inextricable from any fight against an oppressive organization of things.
Team, did you want to follow up to that?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I will. Yeah,
Okay.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
All right, Jayati?
This was simply insightful, Todd. So thank you very much. I'm trying to read Écrits for Kedel's course, and when you read Lacan, you are like, it's all so confounded. I think the presentation was so clear. So, I mean, amazing clarity. There are a couple of things which I was thinking while listening to you. So coming from India, there was something very freeing about your talk, because, this entire burden of motherhood and these identities, and then when this kind of lack between subject and symbolic identity, and the lack in the symbolic identity, somewhere it resonated with Elenka when she says that, what is this woman that you are talking about? So I found your conceptualization somewhere a parallel over there. So a response on that, that's one thing. Second thing, when you were talking of Hamlet, which was brilliant, I was thinking of Antigone. And if you look at Antigone, and there is this sister and there is this disobedient subject. and how I was also thinking that there is a death in both the cases. So there is certain kind of death that is haunting, and there is an insistence which is compelling the living to do something about it, and also bring in these contradictory identities at play. So how do we, I mean, I might not make sense, but I wanted your comment on death over here. That's second thing. Third thing, this lack in symbolic identity is it makes a lot of sense, but I was thinking further, and there is this contradiction that is also play. For example, I see myself as a mother and I see myself as a professor, and I see there is a lack in attaining both, but there is also a contradiction where they both are. Me going closer to a professor is still something where this lack pulls the subject towards that symbolic identity as against the mother, which it doesn't. So I might not be able to think through it, but still I do wish to hear you on that. Yeah. Okay,
those are great. So yeah, Alenka's, I think what I'm saying is totally in line with what Alenka says. And I think are you thinking of what is sex, I assume? Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's totally in line with that. I do think that I like that idea, like, who's this woman that you're talking about? That seems, again, like, right, you're insisting on the way in which the other is lacking and not this full identity. I do think I think this touches on your third question, because I do think that certain positions become imbued with wholeness more than others within a social structure. And I think this touches on what Tim's question was, that seems to me to be the way that an oppressive system structures. Like it wants to identify wholeness in the figure that it's putting in the oppressed position, right? So like mother would be the great example. Like the mother can't be a lacking subject, but has to be figure of wholeness. And so I think you're right that there's a way in which another symbolic identity can actually reveal the lack within that the symbolic identity that is shared, right? I think that happens. I think that it certainly happens. I think this mother professor one, like that professor puts pressure on that mother identity and reveals the lack in it. And I think that happens all the time. But I think that could only happen when the symbolic identity itself is lacking, right? So mother is already lacking, or it couldn't be subjected to that kind of force, external force. So that's, I think is key. And then your second question, I've forgotten it. What's the second?
Antigone and death.
Antigone. Yeah, I think your point about the death is really great. I think that really, like, it's like something's taken away from the symbolic, and that kickstarts this drama of desire and lack. That's definitely true. I do think. Okay, so Antigone, yeah, like the only thing I would say, I think her insistence is different from what Hamlet does. Like Hamlet is much more a figure of questioning. Antigone says, very first scene of the play, I love this about her, but it is so different from Hamlet. She says to Ismene, like, okay, this is what we have to do. You can prove yourself a true sister or a fake one. That's it. Like, there's no, like, oh, what should we do? I don't know. There's none of that, right? So I think that that could only be a pre-modern, that can only be a play in which someone's actually entrenched in a tradition. That it doesn't make any sense in the uprootedness of the modern world, I don't think. So that would be the only thing. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, I like that. The one thing that's the same about them is that they both follow a position all the way to its end point, right? Rather than trying to negotiate it in some way. So I think even though Hamlet is questioning, he still, in the way Antigone's not, he still follows that to its end point.
Yeah, right. Makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Big Sig.
Hello. So Todd, I have a question, and I've been thinking about this since our conversation concerning the real in Lacan, especially from the early Lacan. We always talk about how he really means reality, but there's this interesting notion that you brought up, and we kind of clarified it on impossible real, and what that entails, especially because thinking about how the odd and evens games works, especially when we generate it in that machine, how you can't get a movement of a 3 unless 2 comes after, right? And then if you have a fourth movement, then the movement 3 could, I guess, come first. But it shows like there's this sort of impossibility that's already embedded within this machine, or what we could even call identity.
Yep.
And so when we kind of put it into like psychoanalytic terms, this notion of impossible real, is he trying to tie this in with the beginning of that seminar in which he comments on Levi-Strauss's work of fundamental structures of kinship, with this notion of prohibition of incest? Because Zizek brings this up in For They Know Not What They Do. It's like, why prohibit something that's impossible? So incest, is that impossible real? But why prohibit it anyway? So is that what he kind of ties into with impossible real in seminar 2?
Yeah, I think that's what he's getting at. And I think you're like, the idea is, why do you prohibit the impossible? It's because it's through the prohibition of the impossible that the symbolic structure holds together, right? Like that's this idea of a shared law. Like like accepting that prohibition is accepting the shared lie, because it implies that there really is a way to accomplish the impossible, which there's not. So yeah, I think that does tie together.
Right. It's almost like a sort of like noble lie, right? Of like Plato.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Anything else, Big Sig? Good. All right, Philip.
Todd, I was wondering if you can riff a little bit on the framing of lack being the loss of an unhad object. I was talking with, I take this line from my favorite Mall philosopher. I think Mall commercialism is an underrated philosophy. It'll one day be read with German idealism. But he said, like, people who miss the mall the most are the Zoomers. I thought that was pretty good. Like people
who miss I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. People who miss the mall most are
like Zoomers, like Gen Z.
Oh, okay.
And then I'm wondering also if like the sort of move toward ontological completeness has something to do with like the non-duped error, or the nom de pair. If there is something, I don't know if it's in a conscious or an unconscious structure, that the second that you're like, oh, there's no such thing as ontological completeness, you kind of take the position of the psychotic. I'll leave it there.
Okay. No, yeah, I think, okay, I like that first formulation that you make, that the people who didn't have the mall are the ones that miss it the most. I think that's absolutely right. And I do think there's a way in which that structure of loss seems to me inextricable from capitalist ideology and the fantasy that accompanies that ideology of finally getting this thing that I'm getting back this thing that I've lost. And I think that the avowal of lack in as opposed to loss seems to me impossible if you're remaining a capitalist, a fully invested capitalist subject. So that's what I would say about that. Yeah, sorry, I just forgotten what's your second question again? Say.
Well, it's like what I'm trying to through, like, you know how Lacan will describe jouissance sometimes. It's just like you're both calm and excited. And you like,
Philip, you're choppy. Your connection's choppy, I think.
Cadell, can you remind me what his second question was? I've forgotten totally.
I'm not sure.
Well, maybe we can come back to him.
Yeah, Philip, we'll come back to you if your connection resumes. All right, we'll go to Ira.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'd like to make a little reductionistic joke juxtaposition and then ask 3 questions. So for me, it seems like on the one hand, fundamentalists such as, like, for example, Donald Trump never says, fuck, I might be a narcissist. Or Adolf Hitler never said, man, maybe I'm psychotic. So then there's the rest of us who have some sort of self-doubt or a problem identifying with the symbolic identifier. And then I have 3 questions regarding psychoanalysis. So how would an analyst treat an analysand who suffers from the imposter syndrome? So you have the fundamentalists on one hand, and you have everyone else who suffers from the imposter syndrome on the other. So how would an analyst treat someone who suffers from the imposter syndrome? And then would there be a distinction if the analysand suffered from loss rather than lack? And would the treatment be different for either one of those? And then the last question is, if an analysand passed through a successful analysis, what would he or she or their relation to lack be if the analysis was successful?
Yeah, so it's a nice structured question. And yeah, I think your initial analysis is correct about the psychotic and then the rest of us. And I do think that you're right, that imposter syndrome is almost ubiquitous, except for the few people that are psychotic. But I would say that in a way, the treatment of imposter syndrome is to say, no, don't worry. That position itself is the position you think you aren't itself isn't. That is, you think like, oh, you're not a real, like there's a real priest out there. There's a real, whatever, teacher out there. No, that position itself is lacking. And so
but
I think
I don't see how that helps. Sorry.
Well, maybe it doesn't. I mean, look, it helps in the sense that okay, here's the one way to think of it. Like, so when I was I'm not an analyst, I was just a patient. But when I was in analysis, this is what I would constantly do. I would constantly say, okay, this is what I did here, but that's not what normal people do. And then I would say, what is it normal people do? I would ask the analyst that, right? And my guy would always go, he would just say this, he would go, normal? Like, just to ask a question like that. And it was very effective, because what it forced me to see was that person I was positing as this normal person somewhere who wasn't an imposter was theirself, an imposter, right? Like, that's the idea, is that imposter is ubiquitous, that there's no position outside of that. And then the question is like, where does the trajectory of analysis go? I think the trajectory of analysis, like, if you recognize that, then you're, like, if you want to think about it in the terms that I laid out today, the trajectory of the analysis would go conceiving yourself as a subject of lack, sorry, that was a terrible slip, as a subject of loss, to ultimately conceiving yourself as a subject of lack. And that's the end of, that would be the end of analysis, to recognize the way in which I am my lack. I'm not something that would fill it up. I am it. And that seems to me the trajectory that analysis is trying to get us to go through.
Would the distinction be regarding loss? I am not inherently unwhole. I mean, for me, that concept of wholeness is just a foible of human consciousness. And then regarding lack, I mean, for me, I always resort to Buddhism. The root of all suffering is desire. So if you just gain some appreciation of the privileges and wonderful things we enjoy, that is some kind of balm for your hedonic treadmill of a mind.
Well, okay, couple things. Like, yes, I think that it's a way to get out of this illusion of wholeness. Like, that's one of the main parts of the struggle. But I think Buddhism is divided. Like, I think there are different, obviously, there are different versions, but what you just described, I think psychoanalysis is at odds with that. Because I think the idea of psychoanalysis is not like suffering. Okay, yes, suffering is the cause of my desire, but my desire is also the only source of satisfaction that I have. There's no satisfaction outside of that, and there's no satisfaction outside of suffering. So that I have to learn to see the way in which I can't think about, or I can't hope to obviously I'm going to get rid of certain kind of suffering. But in a way, I have to say, I have to embrace some kind of fundamental suffering as part of my mode of satisfaction. And I think that is different between Buddhism and psychoanalysis.
Well, I mean, the first noble truth is that life is suffering. Life is, but and I. So
right,
I know,
and it's so it's right. So it's not.
I don't think it's at
No, I agree. I agree. That's why I want to say.
I'll just say that the irony is, if someone says, "I am inherently whole and I'm not lacking anything," like, thus I don't need psychoanalysis. Like
That's right. No, that's right. That's right. That's right. So if you're fully in, but the whole point of the theory is that you can never be fully in that position, right? Because you're always like, it comes back to this like desert island thing. Like, you have to have somebody bringing you the food. So even to articulate that to yourself, you have to already be a lacking subject.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
OG.
Well, Todd McGowan, that was a magnificent presentation. I enjoyed it very much. And the
Distinction between loss and lack is quite helpful. And I also appreciated the elucidations on Hamlet. I think bringing in literature is wonderful. So you said on the idea that because there's a kind of lack in the symbolic, you can take it up. I thought that was really interesting because it almost kind of positivizes. There's like a benefit, right? Because we can move between symbolic orders precisely because you don't have this completeness. And it made me think, if I were to have an alternative universe where, say, there was an alternative universe where a complete subjectivity of Daniel was possible, and I were to compare it with this universe where lacking subjectivity, if you grant me those phrases, are possible as Daniel, what would I look over at that alternative universe and go, oh, good thing I'm not over there? Because if I was over there, oh, I'd be missing out on something. So for example, over there, I might not be taking up the symbolic order because I have a completeness. Another example, I'm thinking about imposter syndrome. Because you always feel an imposter, like say you live on a farm or something, hint, hint, and you're like, oh, am I really, this is really for me, then that imposterness actually makes you open up to things like philosophy or reading because you don't have this full rootedness that then closes your mind down, right? So then imposter syndrome has a kind of positive, like there's a positive opening to it. Maybe also if you had full completeness, you wouldn't need other people and you wouldn't have communities, because why would you do that, right? The incentive would not be there. So what I'm thinking about, I suppose, is what would the things in that alternative universe or dimension where complete subjectivity was possible would be missing, that would be completely horrible to be missing, that of course they wouldn't even know they were missing, that us in this universe where we have subjectivity structured by lack are able to do and enjoy that other alternative universe would not. But again, Todd McGowan, I really appreciate your presentation.
Well, I love that idea. I mean, I think it's really great to think about like this alternative universe, but I wonder do you think it's even conceivable, right? Like, I think like, again, it comes back to this desert or the island problem, right? Like, once we're conceiving it, we're introducing lack into it. So we're like, I think you couldn't even imagine movement, right? Like, because movement to us has its basis in lack. And so I think like, once that person in the alternative universe is moving around, I think we're going to think, well, that's a lacking subject. And so, yeah, but I do think, like, if you could imagine that perspective, it would be missing all the horrors of our world, but would also be missing all the things that make our world worthwhile. And I love your example of like a certain kind of dissatisfaction about the farm. Like, I had a certain dissatisfaction about my high school, and that got me to read Jean-Paul Sartre and Being a Nothingness. And if I was like fit in well and was like, I don't know, girls like to go out with me, I would never have read Sartre. And so my life would be radically impoverished by that. And I think it's even hard for me. Like, I think, oh, I really missed out on a lot in high school. I think that all the time. And when I'm thinking back, but what I should think back and say is, thank God I missed out on that, because that got me to read Sartre and then led me to theory and led me to everything that I value today. So I do think that's a really great, I mean, that to me, that little reversal is precisely the dialectical reversal that analysis is hoping to enact on someone.
Well, I would just add quickly and then pass it to Mr. Big Sig, who, again, Todd, your conversations with Theory Underground and Big Sig are always wonderful. It's quite interesting because I actually find that imposter, where then you say don't quite fit in, if you go into those new horizons, actually retrospectively work back and enhances the quality of those things you leave behind, or then you can return to them and have a new appreciation for them as well. So it's interesting. Like, I think I'll talk a bit about David Hume, the philosophical journey, where you have to leave your common life to go on the philosophical
philosophical journey precisely when you return to a sort of rooted, it's not closed-minded or it's not susceptible to like banalities of evil, and actually you have an ability to bring out the wonder of it that you otherwise could not. Maybe as just a thought, I think it's a very good question if this alternative universe is even thinkable. Maybe it'd be a universe where Lacan was never born and no one ever thought of it. It would still have the problems of lack, but no one would know about the problems of lack. So maybe that would be a universe where everyone, you were mentioning Trump, or is psychotic. Like what would a universe look like where no one knew about psychoanalysis, and how would that be different? And what would be the things that people would do that they wouldn't even begin to know about? I guess you could argue that maybe that's our world because not enough people know about psychoanalysis, but maybe
but they do, though, I think, Daniel, I think they do, because I mean, this is a point Freud makes, that people are constantly reading the unconscious of others. And so they're invested in the unconscious much more than they're even consciously aware, right? Like when you see me talking to you, you have much more of an awareness of what I'm unconsciously thinking than I do, right? Like that, and Freud's like, that's true for everyone. So I think you're right, it would be different, but I'm not sure I think there still would be this attunement, would be the word I would use, to the unconscious, even in a world where Freud didn't exist. And I do think that there are intimations of that, like even in Kant and Hegel, obviously, I think so I think that there would be a way in which even in that alternative universe, there would be other ways that we're on the direction to this. But yeah, it would be, I think you're right. It is fascinating to think, what would the experience of lacking subjectivity be like if we had no way to conceptually grasp it, right? Like, I think that seems to me the interesting question. So it'd be one thing if we're attuned to it, is another thing is, can we not conceptually grasp it? And I think even though psychoanalysis is pretty much denied in the larger world, it's still people that have a passing awareness of unconscious, right? Even people that totally reject psychoanalysis, they still think there is an unconscious. So that seems to me like it's still conceptually available to everybody. And I do wonder I think it's a great question. Like, what would it be like? I think we'd be trapped in the idea of loss. I think that would probably be it, right? We'd be trapped in the idea that we lost something if we didn't have this notion of unconscious lacking subjectivity available to us.
The lack helps us escape law. That's fascinating to think, Todd. I appreciate that answer. Thank you very much.
Big Sig.
Hey, Todd. So I have like a more clarifying question. So in seminar 1, he evokes gaze like momentarily in the end, but it's in relation to Sartre's gaze. And then in seminar 11, he talks about gaze of Objet, but rather than using Sartre, he evokes Merleau-Ponty's work on visible and the invisible. And I'm always confused why and what the difference is, because I know in seminar 2, he's very critical of Merleau-Ponty in thinking that psychoanalysis is a humanism, and also for this phenomenology of, I guess, early and mid Merleau-Ponty, whose phenomenology is based on a phenomenology of perception and consciousness. So I want to know like what the clarifications are for gaze in the beginning and later.
Yeah, you mean why? Yeah, I think it's totally different, but it's an interesting question. Like, why doesn't he use Sartre as his point of departure in seminar 11? And why does he return to Merleau-Ponty? I think Lacan he didn't have this relative to Merleau-Ponty, but he had it relative to Sartre, an incredible anxiety of influence. And I think his feeling would have been that Sartre his conception of the gaze is a little too close to what Lacan himself thinks. And I think he wants to, but Merleau-Ponty's notion of the visible is not. So I think he wants to take as his point of departure a thinker he can really depart from. And I think the problem, like when Sartre talks about the gaze, he says, I feel myself caught up in the gaze when I hear leaves rustling behind me as I'm peeping through a keyhole. And that's a little close to, there's something like this encounter with something that's outside of me. So that's why I would say that. Because I think he's trying to take a position that he can more fully differentiate his own idea from than I think would happen if he talked about the Sartrean gaze. And Joan Kopchak in Imagine There's No Woman do make this connection between Sartrean gaze and Lacanian gaze. So I think it seems to me like that has to be the motivation, because clearly he knows Being and Nothingness. He clearly read it. And especially because he's in Seminar 2, he's making reference to it. I mean, part of it too is Merleau-Ponty had just died. I think he's probably more distant from Sartre at this point and trying to distance himself. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that, but I do think he wants to carve out his own territory. And so he wants to take a position that he can start with, a position that he could more firmly distance himself from.
Right. And yeah, I think I'm just like really confused because the example that you gave from Sartre about being caught in the gaze when you see, like, hear the leaves in the wind rumble, like that's like very similar to Lacan, and like it's a field of representation. And I think in the same sense, like with the idea of like the flesh and the visible for Merleau-Ponty, it's like the world staring back at you. But I would say, and maybe I'm wrong, that the gaze of Objet is not necessarily a field of representation, but like a virtual field, right? Or a virtual object, which is quite different, right?
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I think, but yeah, you're right. It's this disturbance within the virtual, right? Like, and I think that's the key. And I think that's what's there in Sartre and is also there in Lacan.
All right, Chitan, final question of the night goes to you, sir.
Thank you. I just have a sort of clarifying question. We've been reading Ecrits and the issue of the insistence on the signifier sort of comes into, starting with the essay called Pull Down Letter, that the Edgar Allan Poe's story upon which he's writing. And from that insistence on the signifier, something like the three positions emerges: the king, queen, and the minister who dupes the queen in that sense. I was when I was reading it, I was wondering how do we think through the three positions that emerge from this insistence, and is that something has to do with the identity question that we've been raising in this talk? Does the identity follows that? Does the triadic problem always hounds the identity at all points of time? Because the question of femininity also emerges within that. The second position is always feminine position in that. The queen's position is the feminine position within that. Thus, identity is always hounded by law, the feminine who hides something from the law, and the third which dupes the feminine. Is something about identity always riddled by this problem? And how do we look at this three in
Complicity.
that?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, it's a good question. I've just finished developing the slides for that chapter. I think, Chitan, what's interesting at the end of that chapter is if you look at the end of the chapter, he introduces the L schema, which is I think it's a quadruplicity. And he literally says that the L schema is an arc upon which we're going to build a bridge. So I think that's his starting towards getting out of the three. And I think the key figure that breaks out of the three, he says, is the detective. Because the detective
also falls back.
Sorry?
Yeah, but the detective also falls back. Detective also never completely escapes. That's the sort of the.
No, he doesn't. But he says the detective. He says the detective helps us get out of the Superman or the hero.
Absolutely, but is that three position always hounding the question of identity for you? Is that one of the things?
Well, I don't think it. Cadell, I don't think it matters if it's three or four. The question is, does it always have the same structure, right? Like, I think. Yeah. I mean, and yeah, it's an interesting question. I do think that there is, is there this movement of, and I think this is is it essential to signification? I think yes. Is there this initial stupid signifier of law, whatever, then the failure to, and then this third position that then marks the failure, right? I think that is, and then there's a subsequent fourth position that tries to eliminate that structure, right? Or quilt that structure in a certain way and then get us beyond it. Yeah, I think that's maybe one of Lacan's most valuable things. He's trying to understand how signification is necessary, what's the structure at work there, and then how we can relate these different points of signification to each other. And then, like, you're right, like woman is his name, for better or worse. I think for worse, woman is his name for this point of failure within initially, like after the master signifier, this lack of a binary signifier. That's what he calls woman. And then the now analyst, I think, comes in this final, I think, Cadell, you're right, like fourth position, and then quilts the structure, and then allows us to, like, yeah, Cadell, go ahead.
I just want to say one of the things that stuck out to me in that, I know this is let me just first say before jumping in again, is these are the types of questions, these are the types of things we're going to be thinking through the entire Écrits course. We're going to be getting deep dives into each of these chapters. We're going to have large scale conversations about all of these chapters. That's the point of the Écrits course, and I think that's what the value of it is. But I just want to say very, very quickly, one of the metaphors that Lacan uses in the Purloined Letter, which I don't think gets enough discussion, is that he seems to be introducing with this specific triad what he calls the politics of the ostrich, which is a very hilarious metaphor. It's like this, we all have our heads in the sand. And when I was thinking about working through this, I was thinking about the different ways I had engaged in intimate relationships, because he wants to get out of this imaginary dyad. And I think that there might be a difference in the triad depending on whether you have your head in the sand or whether you don't have your head in the sand. And I wonder if there's something to this. It's merely a capacity to look, a capacity to almost a perspectival shift on the triad that you're in.
Yeah. I think that's really good, that the fourth position is just changing your relationship to the triad.
Exactly.
Just to sort of, I was listening to Derek Hook's lectures on the Purloined Letter, and he said something very interesting. He said that when in the end of the story, I don't know the name. What's the name of the person? The detective?
Dupin.
Yeah. So when Dupin sort of leaves a letter, in the minister's pocket, and then the letter read something, something about, the Greek. He said because he couldn't resist the temptation of signifying chain. He had to actually write something over there and fall back into that chain. So the fourth never completely falls out, completely comes out also. He also always have to fall back into that chain. And again, something of that chain emerges. Fourth is extremely important, but the fourth always becomes this trajectory back into, in that sense.
Right. I mean, I think that's Hegel's idea of a determinate negation.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't that the whole point of the troglodyte? That's what the fourth movement is doing. Yeah.
Right. Which is why it's tied to, the short session and quilting point, right? Like that's what necrocracy is.
Exactly. So there is something about the signifying chain itself that always re-emerges within the question of identity. I guess so. That's what I was thinking about. That all identities always, in some senses, get stuck within this problematic of the signifying chain, within the insistence of the signifying chain, which identity cannot ever completely escape. There's something about this problem of identity which will always, remain within this insistence of the symbolic domain, subject being subservient to the symbolic domain in that sense. You cannot have a subject, and identity always wants to find a place outside the symbolic domain. There's something about
I think that's right. I think
desires this space to find a space outside this insistence of the signifier. And something about it which I think I was hounding me, and I wanted to sort of get some.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Well, Todd, this was absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for coming for the second seminar. Is there any final reflection you'd like to leave us with, and maybe even some advice about how we might want to spend our time as we approach the Écrits course and
reading the Écrits?
And reading the Écrits?
Yeah, I good luck is my advice. I mean, I think I just would say I think he's trying a lot of times to be obscure. And so one of the, I think like trying to puzzle, for me, reading the Écrits is always like trying to find the little gems and not get bogged down with the coal, right? Like not get like, just read over whatever that's too obscure and get to what, and because I think there are several things that are pretty clear and nicely formulated. And I've always found it more valuable to glom onto that than to spend my time like really poring over each individual sentence. But it's nice that you're going to have the class, because then if there are certain sentences you want to, I think there are certain paragraphs and sentences that are worth an inordinate amount of time, but I don't think that's true of the entire thing. So I think one of the challenges is to pick out what actually merits my time and what doesn't.
Fantastic. And I know that you recommended Capitalism and Desire. Can you give us any more insight on maybe what direction you'll be thinking about psychoanalysis, capitalism, the way you might be trying to think these dimensions?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about, I'll try to relate to certain seminar, but I'm going to try certain écrit, but I'm going to talk about how we can think about value in psychoanalytic terms, and then what that has to say about.
Amazing. Amazing. I'm super looking forward to that. I think that's a really important thing to bring up. So everyone, this was the second seminar for the Écrits. Before we leave, I'm just going to give a little bit of a plug for the course and the rest of the seminars. So
Okay, thanks, Cadell. I'm going to.
Are you jumping off there, Todd?
Oh, I don't have to. I
Okay,
thought you
yeah,
were.
no, please, no, stay if you want. It's just going to be 5 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna give a little bit of a plug here. So on the website, you'll see this is Philosophy Portal. We've got the seminar. So we're not doing any course this summer, but we've got open seminars all July. And we've had Peter Rollins last week talking about pyrotheology, Todd McGowan obviously today. We'll have Isabel Millar and Richard Boothby in the next 2 weeks. So if you want to register for those, you just want to go down here. You'll see the dates, you'll see the time, and you just want to click on one of these links and register. And then you'll see an advertisement for the Écrits course. The Écrits course starts September 3rd. I'll be giving lectures. There'll be 13 lectures in all. There will also be guest sessions from all of our guest lecturers that were here for the seminars. Todd McGowan just emphasized he's going to talk about value and how we can think about value in a psychoanalytic frame. I know Peter Rollins is going to be developing his notion of the Church of the Contradiction, pyrotheology, really bringing our attention to the relationship between psychoanalysis and religion. I know Richard Boothby is actually writing a book on Das Ding, and he's going to be dedicating most of his time to thinking through the concept of Das Ding. And Isabel Millar, I know we've talked a little bit on my channel about her book on artificial intelligence, but she's actually writing a new book on patty politics. And she's dedicating her seminar, which is basically the politics of suffering and enjoyment. And so she's going to be developing her notion of patty politics within this seminar. And it'll be basically our first large scale introduction to her new work. So I'm really looking forward to that. We've had Big Sig here throughout the seminars, and he's going to be co-leading discussions with me in the class, and as well as his partner, Nick Castellucci of the Vanishing Mediators. And also exegetical reading spaces with Dimitri Kroiman. So there'll be spaces where we're specifically highlighting maybe those little gems that Todd suggested we highlight. We're going to highlight those gems, and we're going to open up exegetical reading spaces for those gems. And also Philosophy Portal is not just dedicated to real deep investigations of fundamental texts, but we also emphasize that we create with these texts, and we want to open up collective community spaces to create. So we have conferences, we have anthologies. And so moving through this process is not just to learn Lacan, but also to encourage a collective engagement and creative process that's going to be a long-term mediation. At the end of this, maybe it's a year, maybe it's a bit more than a year, but we will have a publication as an end result of this course. So that's something to get involved with if you're interested. These seminars are just a taste, just a teaser of some of the conversations that I think that at the end of this seminar, you know, talking about the Purloined Letter, how many threads can we dive into here? I mean, I think we're just touching the tip of the iceberg. So you go to the Ecrits course, and then I'll end here, and you'll see sign up on all seminar days. So today I'll have sales for the course. So if you're interested in joining, there's a sale on right now, and it'll go on until midnight Eastern time today. And you just put sign up here. And again, all the information about the course is here. The teacher, the guest lecturers, Dimitri, the exegetical reading space, the vanishing mediators. And so all the information is here. You'll see the schedule here. All course days will be on Sunday. So the goal there is, yes, there's 13 lecture days, but they're all on Sunday evening. And so if you can schedule those times, this fall on Sunday is going to be a Cree day, basically. So if that's something that you want to get in on, just sign up there on Philosophy Portal. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, email me. I have contact information on the website, and I'll be as responsive as I can. So again, I want to thank Todd. Thank you so much for also being a part of this process and helping me with a part of this process. It means a lot, and I'm really looking forward to you developing your ideas on value. And thanks for everyone who's been here throughout the entire seminar. So with that, I'll close up, and I'll see hopefully most of you next week for the seminar with Isabel Millar. All right.
Take care.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Todd.
Thank you all. Excellent.